Divided World, Divided Class by Zach Cope. Section: Mercantilism and the Creation of the Third World. Capitalism first arose in England. It was originally the product of the degeneration of landed property relations, characteristic of late feudalism. That is, the marketization of land to capitalize on expanding urban trade networks and overcome the increasing limits to serfage set by the deconcentration of land ownership. Monetization of the economy accompanying the inflationary influx of precious colonial metals. Spanish America produced 64 million gold pesos of precious metals annually. Provided Europe's proto-capitalists with purchasing power over land and labor, and the possibility of extended credit. Foreign trade based on the world historic conquests of the Americas and of India, and the advances in maritime, navigational, and related military technology which made these possible. Provided Europe with huge monetary wealth and a cumulative contribution to its profit rates. Meanwhile, as European manufactories expanded so as to provision the mercantilist navy and goods to overseas suppliers to exchange for commodities to be sold at home, the process of primitive accumulation helped sustain the armed shipping that facilitated it. English manufacturing industries oriented to colonial markets generated rising wages which catalyzed capitalist struggle for labor-saving technological innovation. Soon, the reserve army of labor created through the enclosure of the English commons was set to work, using newly minted industrial technology. Whilst the prosperity of England's landholding population, and the conspicuous consumption of its colonialist gentry, secured the domestic markets required for capitalism to take root. Primitive accumulation at the expense of Arabs, Asians, Native Americans, and Africans gave huge added impetus to primitive accumulation in Europe itself, where the separation of independent peasant producers from the land, the ruin of the artisans and of the transfer of landed wealth into the hands of the bourgeoisie, was intimately connected to expanding colonial trade. As a renowned British Marxist economist, the late Maurice Dobb, noted, the mercantilist system of, quote, state-regulated exploitation through trade, which played a highly important role in the adolescence of capitalist industry, end quote, was inherently colonialist. Mandel writes, beginning of long quote, in the decisive formative period of the capitalist mode of production, extending from the 16th to the end of the 18th century, the creation of the world market was of crucial importance. But all through this, the period of the birth of capitalism, the two forms of surplus value appeared at each step. On the one hand, it was the outcome of the surplus labor of the wage workers hired by the capitalists. On the other, it was the outcome of values stolen, plundered, seized by tricks, pressure, or violence from the overseas people with whom the Western world had made contact. From the conquest and pillage of Mexico and Peru by the Spaniards, the sacking of Indonesia by the Portuguese and the Dutch, and the ferocious exploitation of India by the British. The histories of the 16th and 18th centuries is an unbroken chain of deeds of brigandage which were so many acts of international concentration of values and capital in Western Europe, the enrichment of which was paid for, in the literal sense of the word, by the impoverishment of the plundered areas. End quote. Mandel underestimates the extent to which the surplus value was directly produced by colonized indigenous American workers, as opposed to their output being simply seized as pillaged wealth during this period of so-called, quote, primitive accumulation. The late U.S. professor of anthropology and geography, James Blount, whose excellent work has demolished many myths of Eurocentric historiography, has shown that the commercial capital of the merchant bourgeoisie was, at the earliest point in the development of the capitalist system, invested in mining and other productive operations in the conquered New World territories, exploiting more laborers, waged and unwaged, and generating more profits than European workers of the time. English textile industry being the major vehicle for Europe's internal transition to capitalism. Arguing against Marxist professor of history Robert Brenner's thesis that capitalism was born sui generis in rural England, Blount insists that those late medieval variables which Brenner links to the rise of an originally agrarian capitalism in England, a landless peasantry, cash tenancy, rural wage labor, large-scale production for sale, peasant struggle, and agricultural innovation, could also be found in many parts of Southern Europe, Africa, and Asia, as could the widespread urbanization Brenner downplays. Blount instead locates the rise of capitalism in Europe's subjugation of the Americas. Beginning of long quote. Europe was no farther along in social evolution than Africa or Asia, painting on a continental-sized canvas, at any time prior to 1492. The single advantage which Europe's mercantile maritime communities enjoyed over the competing mercantile maritime communities of Africa and Asia was location. European centers were some 5,000 miles closer to the New World than any competing non-European center. Hence were much more likely to make contact with New World places and peoples first, and were thereafter certain to monopolize the immense fruits of plunder and exploitation. These New World sources of wealth explain the much more rapid rise of mercantile capitalism in Western Europe than elsewhere, and thus the bourgeois political revolutions of the 17th century. And after capitalism had taken power in its, quote, home countries, and thus could exploit a potential proletariat both at home and in the colonies, it is not hard to see why Europe then entered a period of autonomous progress, and simultaneously squelched the economic and political progress of other parts of the world. End quote. For Marx, too, the primitive accumulation of capital could be witnessed in the conquest and pillage that Europe carried out from the 16th century onward. Beginning of quote. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. End quote. Indeed, some historians have argued that, quote, primary primitive accumulation actually predates the 16th century. Beginning of quote. The rise of capitalism in Europe was a world process whose greatest content was colonial, right from the Crusades, and the Samarkand, Timbuktu, Moroccan, Senegalese, Guinean expeditions of European kings and merchants up to and beyond the driving out of the Arabs out of Europe, which took place after their defeat at Grenada by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain in 1492. End quote. The Crusades were a war of, quote, feudal proto-Europe, an alliance with already powerful banking, commercial, and manufacturing capitalists therein, against rising Arab commerce in the Mediterranean and Arab urbanization in the southern European coasts, Sicily, Spain, and what became Portugal, in the Levant Byzantium era. They were financed by loans, shipping, and materials supplied by the nascent bourgeoisie of Venice, Genoa, Padua, and Naples. These latter cities were, in turn, massively enriched by the primitive accumulation of capital generated in North Africa and the Middle East, and secured through plunder. They went on to provide the initial capital required for Europe to embark on its process of primitive accumulation in Africa and America. Already, gold from the Ghana-Guinea region netted 15th century Europe an average US $3 million, a decade before the 16th century, quote, discoveries of America and Africa. In the same period, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and Italian interests took some 700 tons of gold from North Africa, West Africa, and the Sahara. The contribution of plunder from Africa to the growth of capitalism began in earnest, however, with the slave trade. Slavery was the single most decisive stimulus to the maturing capitalist system in Western Europe. At the end of the 18th century, British Prime Minister William Pitt declared that 80% of all Britain's foreign trade was associated with slavery. The sugar plantations required relatively advanced machinery to process cane, while the transport of slaves boosted the shipping and shipbuilding industries, providing employment opportunities for skilled and unskilled European labor. Selfa notes that in the 1840s, 75% of the raw material for British cotton textile industry, accounting for 75% of British industrial employment, was produced by slaves on colonial American plantations. British historian Robin Blackburn has estimated that slavery profits may have provided anything between 20.9% and 55% of Britain's gross fixed capital formation at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Profits derived from the slave plantations also facilitated much-needed credit flow to the early industrialists. James Watt's invention and production of the steam engine, for example, was wholly financed by capital made from the slave trade. The brilliant South African historian, economist, and highly unorthodox Trotskyist, Hosea Jaffe, one of the handful of Marxist authors who have reached conclusions similar to the present one on the parasitic nature of today's Western working class, has calculated the surplus value produced by U.S. slaves in 1850 as being 8 times higher than in England or in the U.S. for then similarly impoverished, quote, white labor. In sum, Britain's 18th century shipping, banking, insurance, mining, and textile industries were wholly dependent upon slavery. From the 16th century onwards, North and Western Europe took part in the Iberian Peninsula's slave trade, with German Hanse participation in the early voyages of European, quote, discoverers in Africa and the Americas. With the Hanseatic League's growing strength, the region's craft guild system became tied to foreign commerce and to the production of articles to be exchanged for slaves. In the century before the Industrial Revolution, thousands of artisans in London, Kidderminster, and across Britain were engaged in making small items of iron, glass, shoes, candles, hats, pewter, cottons, copper, paper, gunpowder, spoons, casks, containers for brandy, as well as beer, to use for paying African chiefs and the Europeans on the Guinea coasts. In addition, non-manufactured British and Irish goods such as beef, butter, oats, cheese, and potatoes found ready markets in the West Indies. Italy, Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, Denmark, Scandinavia, Germany, and Britain all energetically participated in the slave trade. Settlers from these countries in the Americas, the Cape, Java, Indonesia, and West Africa lived off slavery. As major commercial and industrial entrepôts, New York, Liverpool, Bristol, Plymouth, Glasgow, Dieppe, Rouen, Bordeaux, Calais, Antwerp, Amsterdam, Bremen, Hamburg, and Lisbon flourished principally as ports receiving slave-made produce, sugar, spice, tobacco, coffee, silver, and gold, and as suppliers of guns, brandy, and other goods necessary to the quadrilateral trade. British, French, German, Portuguese, and Scandinavian shipbuilding depended for centuries on slavery, as did the 18,000 European sailors in 19th century Britain and the many more outside it. By 1800, 500 British slave ships comprised over one-third of the total British merchant marine fleet, while 80% of British imports from these ships came from the West Indies plantations alone. After its national unification in the 1579 Treaty of Utrecht, Holland's successful rivalry with Spain secured the beginnings of a Dutch slave trade, which by 1619 was exporting slaves to Dutch settlers in North America. Growing after the 1641 defeat of Portugal at Malacca, Malaysia and Sri Lanka in 1649. Dutch expansion was only checked by Britain's 1651 Navigation Act and the total triumph of British slaving by the mid-19th century. The Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, Finnish, Russian, and Polish capitalists were also, quote, monarchically protected participants in the slave traffic, via the Baltic and North Seas, and the late Holy Empire, behind which stood the economy of the German Hanseatic League. All of these countries had or manned slave forts on the West African coast and had settlers in America. End quote. In short, increased agricultural productivity and the growth of a class of urban artisans and traders coincided with the massive concentration of capital in the hands of a merchant bourgeoisie taking advantage of slavery-based trade with colonial America to propel Europe to the core of a new incipiently capitalist world economy. As a consequence, whilst mining and other exploitative operations in the Americas had given European capitalism its first decisive comparative advantage in world trade, slave production in the Caribbean and American sugar and coffee plantations, where brutality and subjugation were the order of the day, provided its second. Both together constitute the historical foundations of the current pyramidal system of international inequality. End section.